On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome back to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area. Today's agenda is relatively short. Bear with me as I try to pull up the agenda for today and some slides. Actually, I can just tell you it'll be, actually, I'll share it this way. We'll do a short somatics grounding practice again with Melissa Fan. And then I'll actually be filling in for Samar Arabi this week from AROC, doing updates and political developments. And then we'll have some short announcements after that. And without further ado, let me hand it over to Melissa to begin our somatics grounding this week.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today and for tuning in. We are over 6 months into witnessing the most horrendous genocide in Palestine. One day of witnessing the brutality should have been enough to stop the world in its tracks. And yet here we are more than 6 months and 75 years later. I know that a lot of us are exhausted. More of our comrades are getting sick and experiencing debilitating fatigue. Some of us are getting crispy with each other. The past several months of intense and heightened action and the repression and oppression in reaction to that by the state and Zionist institutions, alongside the daily witnessing of genocide, is catching up to us. If this is you, please know that what you are experiencing is normal and expected. What you are experiencing is the side effect of bearing witness to and fighting against colonization. And this is a history that many of us hold in our lineages too. So it's activating intergenerational trauma. So first, I want to normalize what you might be feeling in your body. And then I want to say that this is the time to build capacity so we don't burn out and we stay in this fight for the rest of our lives. And we can't build capacity alone. Capacity building is a community effort. So for today's somatic practice, let's feel into and call in our communities. Colonization conditions us into individualism so that in moments of stress and struggle, we might find ourselves wanting to isolate. But we all need each other. As Audre Lorde says, without community, there is no liberation. All right, so finding yourselves in a comfortable seated position. You could also be laying down or standing up. And just really feeling the weight of gravity. If your feet are able to be on the floor or on the ground, really feeling the soles of your feet and finding all of your toes. You might be surprised in this toe finding practice to discover that it's difficult to find all of your toes. Just some noticings about your own body. And from there, finding your hands as well, maybe wiggling your fingers. And with the next breath in, breathing all the way to your hands and to your feet. And now breathing at your own pace, holding your hands out to your side like this, but down at in a comfortable position. With your palms open, just begin to call in your community. All of us are parts of a variety of different communities. There might be one central community, or there might be dozens of smaller communities that we're part of. So just holding all of these in your mind and in your body. And identifying just one person who in your community might need somebody to check in with them. All of us deserve care. All of us deserve community. All of us deserve to be checked in with. So just identifying one person in your community who might need somebody to check in with them. And sending that person some love today. To energetically say, I got you, and I'm going to check in with you. And from there, bringing your hands, one to your heart and one to your belly, if that's comfortable and accessible for you. And really feeling that you are also part of all of these communities, that you deserve to be checked in with, that you deserve care, you deserve rest, to be loved, to be free. And from here, identifying one person in your communities who you can ask to check in with you. This might feel like a bit of a growth edge if you're used to doing things alone or just powering through. And this is a practice of strengthening community bonds. So that's checking in with others, and that's also allowing us to be held, allowing ourselves to be held too. And just right here, sending yourself a little bit of love. Yeah, we're all doing our best, and we're here, we're showing up, we're building capacity, and we're committed to be in this fight for a free Palestine. Thank you for practicing with me today.
Melissa, thank you as always for grounding us and helping us to build long-term resilience. I'm going to share my screen again and bear with me for a minute. Okay. So as Melissa mentioned, we are past 180 days, and the death toll is currently above 33,000, with at least 76,000 injured. Of course, the general consensus is that those numbers do not represent the actual totals. And the World Health Organization's recent reporting indicates that nearly 8,000 people have been reported missing or are under the rubble, with 1.7 million people being displaced. And that's the vast majority of people in Gaza. And as you can see here, the infrastructural damage is near total. The majority of residences are damaged. The majority of businesses are damaged, school buildings, religious sites, etc. And the most vital infrastructure for survival, like water wells, are simply not functioning, with 83% of them not being operational. And we'll talk a little bit more about this today in this update. The majority of medical facilities are simply out of commission. So last week when we were off, we did not get a chance to talk about the siege of Al-Shifa Hospital and the attacks on the World Central Kitchen humanitarian workers. And I want to address both, but I think it's important for us to start with Al-Shifa, which has unfortunately not gotten the kind of constant attention it warrants, especially in comparison to the discussion around World Central Kitchen. And we should talk about why that is. So this is a massacre that took place over a 2-week period in which the Israeli military raided and occupied Al-Shifa Hospital, the largest hospital and medical complex in Gaza. The hospital actually opened in 1946, 2 years before the Nakba, and prior to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. It was only one of two hospitals in Gaza. So its existence predates the formation of Israel itself. And the scope and scale of what happened in Al-Shifa over the 2 weeks from March 18th to April 1st was, in the words of UN Special Rapporteurs Mafokeng and Albanese, an atrocity that they're, quote, still unable to fully document due to its scale and gravity, and clearly represents one of the most horrific assaults on Gaza's hospitals. And that's saying a lot. And the images and stories about the decomposing bodies and strewn body parts of the victims of the massacre are truly beyond horrific. And sadly, it doesn't appear that the media is really taking up this story more broadly, especially in the United States. Mondo Weiss has a pretty harrowing account on their site that talks about how Israeli spies were stationed outside the hospital for a long time prior to the raid, how doctors who refused to leave their patients were summarily executed on site after their refusal, and how those suspected of being part of Hamas were executed in mass and then bulldozed into mass graves. So WHO, the World Health Organization, issued a report on what happened at Al-Shifa, calling it a total loss, and that any attempts to restore it to even minimal functionality are, quote, implausible and will require substantial efforts to assess and clear the grounds for unexploded ordnance. They also documented shallow mass graves with only partially covered bodies decomposing and emitting a pungent and pervasive smell. And reports from the acting hospital director that patients were, quote, held in abysmal conditions during the siege. They endured severe lack of water, food, healthcare, hygiene, and sanitation, and were forced to relocate between buildings at gunpoint. At least 20 patients reportedly died due to lack of access to care and limited movement authorized by the Israeli Defense Forces. And the WHO also stated that the agency did make attempts during the siege to reach the hospital to medically evacuate patients and staff, but were denied, delayed, or impeded by Israeli forces. So just an absolutely horrific atrocity that will and should go down as one of the worst mass killings in this genocide and in the recent history of international conflicts. In addition to the sheer cruelty and horror of the killings at Al-Shifa, the inability for the hospital to function or be recovered is a tremendous loss for Gaza at a time when now the UN is reporting that there are only about 10 hospitals left that are functioning, and now 4 field hospitals out of 5. Um, and among the 10 hospitals, they are on average about 320% above capacity. That's on average for all those remaining hospitals. And there are only 30% of any other primary healthcare facilities that are still functioning in the region. And because of the attacks on Palestinian journalists and the disinterest of the Western media, we rarely get updates on the ongoing outbreaks of communicable diseases like respiratory infections, diarrhea, scabies, lice, and jaundice. So there are miserable conditions that are exacerbated and exacerbating rather an already physically and mentally traumatized population. Malnutrition is as high as 17% in northern Gaza for children between 6 months and 5 years old. And this is why the Al-Shifa massacre and the attacks on humanitarian workers are so significant, because they are intended to compromise the ability of Palestinians to care for themselves and their health on a routine basis, let alone manage the horrific injuries caused by the US-made bombs that Israel is using. So let's talk a little bit about World Central Kitchen. I'm sure many of you have seen this image of the convoy, the World Central Kitchen convoy, especially the punctures in the roofs of the vehicles, and where drone missiles were, surgically penetrated and killed the occupants of the cars. I'm also sure you're aware that the cars were attacked in sequence and that the World Central Kitchen workers in one part of the convoy went to rescue the survivors of the first car that was struck, only to then be subsequently under fire as they were trying to transport the wounded away. Um, the images of the workers' bodies and their Western passports made headlines everywhere and have undoubtedly become a turning point in global opinion. Now, there's, some important things I think to unpack about the situation and about the changing tide of opinion among the political class in the West. First, it should be noted that Jose Andres, the head of World Central Kitchen and a famous restaurateur, particularly in Washington, D.C., has been collaborating with the State Department and with the Israeli government for some time, and in fact was very vocal in condemning not only Hamas after October 7th, but a prominent Spanish minister in his native Spain, who had spoken out against Israel's war and its occupation, and he actually called for her resignation. He's now, changed his rhetoric drastically after the killing of his staff, calling their murders systematic and criticizing Israel's war as one, quote, against humanity itself. Uh, Peter Osborne wrote for Middle East Eye last week that the killing of the workers is indeed tragic and indeed emblematic of Israel's modus operandi in this genocide. However, he rightly pointed out that the hypocrisy of Western media outlets, including in Britain's papers, where he's located, which widely condemned the attack on World Central Kitchen workers, but have been nearly entirely silent on the killing of Palestinian UNRWA workers or Palestinian humanitarian workers writ large throughout the genocide. Um, in fact, we know that Western media was complicit in promoting Israeli propaganda against UNRWA that has led to its defunding by the West when it's a critical lifeline against mass starvation. And as Osborne put it, quote, the real crime in the eyes of the West, and he's referring to these World Central Kitchen killings, was Israel's slaughter of white people, end quote. Um, it's also important to note that there's another feature in Mondo Weiss from yesterday, written by a Palestinian worker who previously resigned from WCK, World Central Kitchen, after its leadership, including Jose Andres, had failed to listen to a significant and near majority of its staff at some point, who raised concerns about their public positions on what was happening in Palestine, including WCK's defense of Israel's actions, its ignoring of the blockade, the existing blockade, the cutting off of water supply, and the mounting civilian deaths in those earlier months of the genocide, and their general partnership with the IDF in these operations. So it's worth checking that out. Again, like we'll send these articles out with our follow-up email or links to them rather. And the article offers a really scathing indictment from this Palestinian worker of WCK's leadership, saying that, quote, much of the work in a genocide is not pulling the trigger, but instead minimizing and denying that a genocide is going on. Genocide is a phenomenon of gradual boundary pushing. Each increment must be accepted by the parties with agency for the next to be reached. Under the direction of CEO Aaron Gore, Linda Roth, and Chief Feeding Officer Jose Andres, World Central Kitchen recklessly endangered its personnel, selfishly exploiting the situation for its own benefit, and actively participated in the normalization of an ongoing genocide. Now, notwithstanding the cynicism that this kind of race-based outrage might engender, the intense coverage of the WCK killings has certainly increased pressure, and at the very least come at a time when the administration's support for the war is receding, notably, significantly. Even Nancy Pelosi, who's been generally terrible on all aspects of the crisis in Palestine, joined at least 40 other Democrats in asking Biden to halt pending arms transfers to Israel and to place conditions on future ones. including and especially adherence to international law. Now, of course, this administration has shown little to no respect for international law, and as recently as a week or so ago was calling the UN resolution calling for a ceasefire non-binding. But again, it's still significant, I think. And as the Axios report points out, there are a lot of indications of other fractures in the political establishment support for the Biden administration's role in what's happening in Gaza. Senator Coons from Biden's home state of Delaware has talked about consequences for Israel if there's a Rafah invasion, and numerous other political strategists, including those from the Obama administration, are slamming Biden over his leaks of his private outrage, calling them ineffectual and weak. Richard Haas, a Bush-era advisor and a longtime part of the foreign policy establishment, was on either MSNBC or CNN, I can't remember, but I went so far as to call for sanctions against Israel as a necessary means at this stage, while criticizing Biden as looking weak and impotent and questioning the need for 1,000-pound bombs and why those are being sent by the administration to Israel. And as we can see, Elizabeth Warren has maybe one of the first senators to sort of maybe publicly sort of almost call it a genocide. Again, there's always a little bit of hedging there. I want to see if I can also share just a little bit of, notwithstanding this public outcry, this little clip from Tess Ingram, who's a UNICEF spokesperson who just did a trip on a coordinated mission in Gaza, which also illustrates that despite what's happened with the WCK workers, that the threat of violence and death against humanitarian workers is not yet overcome.
Going on a coordinated mission to the north of Gaza today. Coordinated mission means that we let the parties to the conflict know where we're going, at what time, so that they can meet their obligations under international humanitarian law to keep us safe. The plan for today is to go to 4 locations. We're going to go to the Camel Adwan Hospital, where we know that children are dying from malnutrition. The mission today has a truck full of ready-to-use therapeutic treatment and high-energy biscuits. Then we're going to the Jabalia Health Centre to do the same. We've also got a truck of fuel that we're going to take to 2 water locations to try and help bring clean water back to the people of North Gaza.
The clearance has actually just come through and it's UNICEF only. UNRWA security can come, but their programmatic staff aren't allowed to come.
And we got to the holding point, but unfortunately there's a problem with the truck carrying the nutrition supplies. While that was happening, active shooting broke out in the area. Our car was hit by a few bullets.
We've just got back and there's some pretty clear bullet hits here and another one here along the window and a few others. Biggest issue today is that we didn't make it. They're the sorts of delays that stop us from implementing our programs, delivering aid and doing our jobs. But we're not going to give up. We're going to try again, hopefully later this week.
So what's notable there is that's obviously being published by UNICEF, but also in subsequent reports and interviews, she described the shooting and bullets coming from during a stop at an Israeli checkpoint and coming from the Israeli checkpoint. So again, still looks like Israel is not doing all it can to let humanitarian workers through and potentially continuing to target them. So I want to talk about other shifts that come along with this shift in domestic and global opinion. There have been some really notable shifts in the military campaign, perhaps encouraging or maybe just more alarming, depending on how you interpret them. One of the big stories from the past few days has been the Israeli military's apparent withdrawal from Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. Now, the reasons why this happened are maybe a bit hard to decipher entirely. On one hand, this could be part of the ongoing fallout and preparation preparation, for some pause or end to the conflict. On the other hand, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, has said things like Israel's job is complete in that part of southern Gaza, and that these forces that are being withdrawn will be redeployed, potentially or especially for Rafah invasion. In any event, there are several stories over the last week, a couple weeks, just documenting from Palestinian journalists and other world media outlets showing Gazans, returning to absolutely barren and destroyed landscapes in Khan Yunis. And it appears that Khan Yunis is exemplifying, Israel's strategy to make Gaza uninhabitable for Palestinians and thereby ensure either their death or their displacement. Speaking of Rafah offensive, Samer had the same title for his slides a few weeks ago with a question mark. And as I just mentioned, the Israeli defense minister has stated that Israel is making preparations for Rafah, which he has actually stated would be similar to the Al-Shifa raid, which is just an insane thing to say, while that atrocity is still being understood in its scope. Netanyahu has also said there is a date that's been set for the offensive, and Israeli newspapers are reporting that the far-right members of Netanyahu's cabinet, like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, are privately accusing him of caving to international pressure and even threatening to pull their political support for him if he doesn't go ahead with the Rafah attack. We've talked about this numerous times in the previous weeks. Netanyahu is fighting for his political survival, and it has long appeared that the war against Gaza is an attempt to extend the lifespan of a political career that is on the ropes. So while increasing international pressure and internal US pressure is generally a good thing, I think it's important to be aware that Netanyahu is operating with some level of desperation himself, and that he's dependent on right-wing forces that are the most bloodthirsty and genocidal elements of the Israeli political establishment. If you've been watching or reading some element of mainstream news in the US, you've probably noticed a little bit of a shift in the news segments or even in the opinion pieces that are being written. But not to be outdone as the premier apologist for this genocide, and even with all that's happened and that I just described over the last couple of weeks, and with experts making it absolutely clear that a Rafah invasion would be absolutely cataclysmic for Palestinian survivors in Gaza, we still get opinion pieces like this in the New York Times, this time from Benny Morris, who's a longtime Zionist apologist and Israeli academic. And he opens the piece by saying that Netanyahu is the, quote, most incompetent, corrupt, and divisive Israeli prime minister ever, but, end quote, but that he is, quote, right, because it is crucial for Israel to conquer Rafah and destroy the Hamas battalions protected by a human shield of 1.4 million residents and refugees from the north. It's terrible propaganda and not necessarily a great use of your time to read this, but it is notable in its revealing the cynical logics of what's going on and how this war is continuing to be justified by elements of the Zionist political movement, including this admission that is up here on the slide that, quote, Israel can be considered the least safe place on earth right now, which is, it looks like Morris is not able to sort of draw the connection to that being a consequence of its long settler colonial history, but especially because of the genocidal campaign that Netanyahu, in his words, the most corrupt prime minister in its history, has pursued on its half. So not surprising from the New York Times, but nonetheless disturbing. This week also saw the commemoration and celebration of Eid, and there are numerous stories discussing the tribulations of Palestinians trying to commemorate the holy day while struggling to find food and adequate shelter. It was also a day in which the Israeli military targeted and killed the children and grandchildren of key Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh and At least 3 of his sons were killed, and when he was asked about it, he went on record to emphasize that Palestinian leaders would not back down to Israel even if their families were targeted. And of course, we know that these kinds of targeted attacks on family members of Hamas or other political formations in Palestine are a long-standing tactic that they've endured for a long time. So probably most troubling and unclear at this stage is what will happen next between Iran and Israel and the United States. Last week, Israel struck the Iranian embassy in Damascus in Syria, killing 16 people, including high-level leadership in the Iranian military. Iran has promised retaliation publicly, and again, the New York Times has taken the opportunity to publish a bizarre article focused on the legal technicalities that might help Israel elude accountability or sanction for what's undoubtedly a reckless aggression and escalation. It's not clear here, but it's that second headline on the left: Israel bombed an Iranian embassy complex. Is that allowed? Just mind-boggling what's happening inside the newsroom at the Times. There's also this article by Paul Pillar in Responsible Statecraft, which talks about what is possible or likely afoot here, with Israel instigating a conflict with Iran to escalate its way out of what appears to be an objective that's just out of reach, namely destroying Hamas. And the article identifies 2 ways in which an Iran conflict would help Israel work its way out of the dead end in Gaza. First, by provoking Iran's retaliation, which would push the public discussion from genocide back to Israeli self-defense, and second, by increasing the chance that the U.S. gets involved. And the U.S. could be forced to get involved through internal political pressure to defend its key ally Israel, which is a bipartisan kind of attack to Israel that we've seen over the last several months, and potentially if U.S. military targets are hit, which is a distinct possibility given the U.S. military presence in the Middle East, how it is tied up in the Israeli military apparatus, and of course because it may be explicitly targeted by Iran because of the U.S. role in resourcing the genocide. And we know that U.S. Central Command Chief Michael Kurilla visited Israel recently to talk with their military leadership, including their defense minister, to discuss defense against possible attacks from Iran. And as a Pentagon spokesman stated, to, quote, reaffirm the U.S. ironclad commitment to Israel's security against threats from Iran and its proxies. So certainly troubling news and something for all of us to pay close attention to. A wider war would certainly be worse for other communities in the region. It would definitely endanger the security of the globe and certainly open the door for more imperialist opportunism, especially since the U.S. and many U.S. politicians have long viewed eliminating or fully destabilizing Iran as a critical step towards fuller control of the region. But most importantly, it would increase the fog of war and make it difficult to assess what happens in Gaza, especially what may happen in Rafah. So, obviously we want that to not escalate. I think there's potentially mutual interest among the parties in it not escalating, but given some of the other contexts and the way things have moved, it is certainly something to keep close tabs on. So just to switch gears a little bit, on these last few slides, and to take note of some things that are happening on the domestic front. Last week, nearly 50,000 voters cast their primary ballots in Wisconsin as uncommitted or uninstructed, continuing a growing movement to call for Biden's accountability through what has been considered a foregone nomination process in the Democratic Party. This nation piece takes a look at the progress of the campaign, and I wish I had Summer's crafts handy, but what's notable here is that as of last week, more than 500,000 voters, over 500,000 in the U.S. have cast Democratic Party votes for uncommitted, uninstructed, or no preference. And it all started with organizers from Listen to Michigan, and has now resulted in at least 25 delegates being secured for the Democratic National Convention. The BDS movement has also seen major progress in its campaigns, and I just want to highlight a couple things here. Just bear with me for 1 second. First, McDonald's. You may have seen the news that McDonald's has bought out all of its Israeli franchises as a result of sales losses stemming from pro-Palestine boycotts, as this article in Fast Company details. And as the BDS movement has publicly noted, this actually increases McDonald's, the corporation's proximity and complicity to the genocide now that it has bought out these franchises. So the boycott is still very much on, but it does signify that boycott tactics are shifting economic conditions for genocide enablers and supporters. Pitzer College, a private liberal arts institution here in California, recently dropped its study abroad program at the University of Haifa in Israel. College officials are saying the program was dropped because of low enrollment, not because of an academic boycott, but students at Pitzer pointed to several shifts in political conditions that they helped initiate over the last few years, including the Student Senate, voting to cut ties with Israeli universities, faculty members voting to end the program in 2018, but being vetoed by the college president, and alumni organizing to pledge to not donate to the college unless it ended the program, as all of them have been pointed to as material changes that led to this BDS victory. So, BDS BDS organizing is working on multiple levels, and kudos to everyone who is helping these campaigns take shape and mobilizing people at the global, national, regional, and local levels to be part of them. So I want to conclude here. I have been half joking with my CP comrades and others that we need to put together a weekly highlight reel of US politicians getting bird dogged at their events, because there are just so many courageous organizers, including students and other protesters, who've been relentless in calling out politicians for their support and for their failure to speak up about what's happening in Gaza. There are always more than a few of Biden on the campaign trail each week, some recent ones with Pelosi and Hillary Clinton. And it's really noteworthy that a publication like Rolling Stone has done a recent feature on Biden bird dogging this week. So encourage folks to check that out. And speaking of courageous people challenging those in power, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the brave law students the brave law student who spoke up at a dinner that, according to the National Lawyers Guild, was a school sanctioned event at the house of Dean Chemerinsky, Dean of UC Berkeley Law School, and his wife, Catherine Fisk, in which she was assaulted by Miss Fisk after attempting to speak up about the genocide in Gaza. And actually, she hadn't even mentioned Palestine at that point. She was mostly talking about Eid and the importance of thinking about those who are struggling and suffering at the moment. Notwithstanding the possibility that this was a university event and not just a private dinner, the fact that one of the U.S. legal field's most touted scholars on First Amendment and constitutional issues responded to the students' earnest attempt to bring attention to the genocide in this manner is shameful, as are the statements and threats of discipline he's subsequently issued against the students through the law school and in the press. I do want to try to just play that clip as well, since maybe folks have not seen it, but I'll play that before I close out.
Where millions of Muslims around the world fast, not only from the
not only from my house. We have attorneys. We have attorneys.
Okay, you don't have to get aggressive.
Please leave our house. You are guests at our house.
This is our First Amendment right.
No,
this is our First
this
Amendment.
is my house.
The National Lawyers Guild has informed this is our First Amendment right.
My house.
And they are
where millions.
So again, just tremendous respect for the courage of the students who undertook this protest, and particularly the student in particular who was the one who was assaulted, and uh, and gratitude for the National Lawyers Guild, which is supporting them through this process. So that'll conclude our update for today, but I wanted to just do a couple of housekeeping reminders. As always, check out AROC's event calendar to find out what's happening in terms of local solidarity actions, art bills, or political education. Stay connected. Stay connected to what's going on by texting PSA to 833-633-0604 to be on AROC's texting alert system. And as always, if you haven't already, I think it's a good resource to sign up for the Palestine Media Tracker for a weekly digest of top stories. We'll be back again next week with another PSA and are still planning to bring some special guests to do some deeper dives on what's happening in Palestine and with our global solidarity work. A reminder to everyone that this coming Wednesday is Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Day, or Palestinian Prisoner Day. And we'll have a special guest, Sahara Francis from Adamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, in conversation with Mohammed Sheikh from Critical Resistance on the Friday following that, which is April 26th, not the Friday of that week, of next week, so the following week, to talk about the situation with Palestinian prisoners right now across Palestine. As always, thank you so much for joining us for our PSAs. Stay tuned, get others to join these, and stay connected. And till then, please keep up the fight for a free Palestine. Thank you all, and we'll talk to you soon.